Welcome to Establish the Edge. I'm your host, Mike Leone, holding down the stereotypes for real today. If you're watching on the Establish the Edge YouTube channel, I am recording from not only a basement, but my parents' basement as some work gets done on my house. I'm joined by Mark Dankenbring, Jack Miller, who have been grinding the Establish the Run projections and rankings for us all off season. And the episode today is going to be like dominating your home league. I've got a couple home leagues under my belt. I hope if you're listening, you still got some to go. I know some have already been drafted, but a little easier to do this episode after getting some of those actually under my belt and seeing how those, go. And there's a lot of variance in terms of knowing the market for your specific league, which is going to be important. But we're going to talk through in general how things change for us in a home league versus a high stakes online league. And also, where we might deviate from the Establish to Run rankings. Even if you don't have access to those, you can get access if you become a Draft Kit member over at Establish to Run. But if you don't, I think this will still be useful. Let's start, I guess, like any high level thoughts, Mark, before we get into kind of like position by position.
I think mostly, it's good to know like your home league, who your league mates are, and typically what their draft style is. And then just knowing the scoring format and roster format are kind of things I always stress, going into home league drafts, just knowing, okay, is this half PPR or full PPR? Can I start 3 wide receivers in a flex, or is it 2 wide receivers and 2 flex? All those little, just like details that are so good to hone in on and make sure you're locked in going into your home league draft, because settings vary a lot more. Obviously, like when we're in full best ball season, pretty much everything on Underdog is the same roster format, similar with DraftKings. Every draft you do there is the same roster and scoring format. So just make sure know your home leagues. And then also, I think understanding what your waiver priority is. If you do fab budget, I think that can lend itself to more like 0 RB builds or hero RB builds, where that you're going to be able to bid heavily on running backs early in the season on waiver wires. So just knowing your league settings, I think, is honestly one of the most important things and can get sometimes overlooked. You're on mute, Leone.
Classic. I'm just running the gamut today. I know the advice we give a lot of the times on ETR and on this channel is like very wide receiver heavy. But to Mark's point about knowing your league settings, like a lot of these drafts we're doing, you can start 4 wide receivers and they're full PPR. If you're in a home league that's even half PPR with 2 wide receivers and 1 flex, that's still going to change it pretty dramatically because the positional scarcity changes a lot. And, as Mark said, you got to know your league mates and how they're going to draft. And I think that segues into quarterback, which we'll start with the quarterback strategy. In general, I like to kind of use quarterback as a position where there's generally one value, like within a bucket of the quarterback that like if I know all quarterbacks go pretty early, like there's one value that I can kind of hold on to where it's going to be like, well, I'll get Daniel Jones or A-Rich late in this league. Or if I know the elite quarterbacks aren't going to go quite as early, it might be I can get, Lamar Jackson in the 4th round or Justin Herbert maybe in the 6th round. This year, it's a little bit more all over the place because I think quarterback ADP in general is a bit more efficient as these elite guys go earlier. Last year, I don't remember I think you were with me on this podcast last year,
Yeah.
Or like one of the last 2 years. And we were like pretty into the elite quarterbacks because they were going rounds 5 to 6. Like this year, that's not happening. So Jack, given that the quarterback ADP on the top guys is, more like round 3, maybe even round 2 sometimes in a home league, how do you feel about approaching that position?
I think part of it comes down to knowing your league mates as well as your league size. I think if you're in like an 8-man league, then it becomes more of a priority to get one of those elite guys because everyone's going to be so stacked at running back and receiver that you can kind of get those positions later. And you can afford a Jalen Hurts, at pick 25 overall. Whereas if you're in a bigger league, it's a lot harder to build out running back and receiver depth later. So maybe you do that early and then find one of the higher upside quarterbacks later in the draft. And then if you don't get one of the elite guys, I think drafting 2 is more viable. We've mentioned this on a couple of pods, but just taking multiple swings at a couple of players who can get you that mid QB1 ceiling, and then if they both work out, then you can play it based on matchups. So that's kind of how I'm approaching quarterback this year in home leagues.
Yeah, you can't really stream anymore. Like, I don't think that's viable off the waivers. But as Jack said, you can take, Daniel Jones and Anthony Richardson are pretty cheap, and like hopefully one of them becomes a clear starter, and you can drop the other one. Or there's guys like Geno, Kirk Cousins. I go to those because we're considering those in our FFPC draft we're sharing together. But they're pocket passers, but they're on teams that have a good enough supporting cast and good enough play calling that they can be, back end quarterback one for pretty cheap. So yeah, there is more options, I think, to go late round quarterback if your league really splurges too much at the position. And in these, managed leagues, there's going to become a point that people stop drafting quarterbacks because they, if they're drafting really premium draft capital at the quarterback position, they're probably not taking a backup quarterback. Though I will say I'm in some home leagues where people draft 2 and 3 quarterbacks for no particular reason. So again, you got to be somewhat tethered to your market, because I've gotten shut out in an auction in that format where I'm like, I'm going to get these guys for cheap, and they keep going. But yeah, Dimes and Richardson are probably 2 of my favorite targets of going late round. Lamar is like a discount premium quarterback, and I think Herbert has a really high ceiling this year. Jack, I know you were in on Deshaun Watson too. Like, if he falls in those like 8th, 9th rounds, Dank, anyone in particular that you like this year?
Yeah, on the high end, I like Lamar and Herbert as well. Are kind of like the, Lamar. I think belongs in that tier 1 of quarterbacks, and you can typically get him in the 3rd or 4th round as opposed to late 2nd, early 3rd with like the Hurts, Allen, Mahomes types. And then Herbert also, as you mentioned, so similar names to you. And then if I don't get either of those guys, I definitely think I'm targeting kind of the range that, again, we've discussed: Daniel Jones, Anthony Richardson, Geno Smith. Those 3 are ones I'd feel comfortable only rostering one quarterback and kind of starting those guys every week. So, I'm drafting a league tomorrow night with college friends, and we only have 5 bench spots. So I pretty much always try and lean into like elite quarterback, because I don't want to spend one of those 5 bench spots on a backup quarterback. So I really, I might jump up a few spots and kind of go off ETR's rankings a little bit just to secure, that elite quarterback, so I don't have to worry about rostering a second on my bench.
Yeah, I think quarterback is the hardest position for us to rank, like, positionally. So I think the biggest thing is to find like where we deviate from the market most in a positive way, and take that player at a time that you find reasonable. League drafts quarterbacks, not necessarily exactly where they're ranked in terms of all the players on ETR. Let's jump to another onesie position, because I kind of like starting with the onesie positions because I treat those a little differently in home league. Quarterback not prioritizing quite as much as in the past, again, because of the increased cost. But tight end, I still think this is one where I'll give some tiebreakers to elite tight end in a home league, just because it's harder to manufacture that upside really late in your draft. There are some options this year that we like that we'll talk about, but if I'm at the 2-3 turn and it's difficult, I don't mind taking Mark Andrews over T. Higgins type, who I really like, just to kind of lock in that upside at the position. Where I try to be careful is that tier of like, if Dallas Goedert really gets pushed up, and I like him, but like those are the type of guys that I start to get concerned, where it's like a really good range to maybe draft some breakout pass catchers or breakout running backs, and the floor ceiling might not be as good as you think at the position. So, Jack, any thoughts at tight end?
Yeah, I view it similarly, where I'm fine paying up for Andrews at the 2-3 turn. Tight end is a position where I pretty much always find myself only drafting one, because even if I get a low end tight end 1, or even if I get like a high end tight end 2 type, because all the tight ends go and it doesn't pan out, there are always a couple guys every year that go really late and that just slip into free agency that you can kind of pick up. And you can also stream the position more easily than you can at quarterback and just hope for a touchdown. So that's pretty much how I'm playing tight end. I agree with you that I'm not taking the Goddard types as much, especially if they start to creep up. But like Kelsey and more so Andrews, I find myself targeting in home leagues, and then if not, just taking one late and playing the wire.
Yeah, and I'm with you. I think tight end's a position on the wire that you want to react to pretty quickly in the season, just because there's so much uncertainty. I think it's good to just kind of ride the hot hand early and just hope that production lasts. Like we've seen it with like Dalton Schultz for some years and different guys like that. Where I might take two is if you could get like Laporta and Musgrave, some of these rookie tight ends late, but I'd be quick to move on from one of them, just kind of hope that it becomes clear after the first 2 weeks, like which one of those is going to be your starter, move on from the other one. I'm a homer, so I'm really into Dalton Kincaid. If he sneaks later, he's someone who's going to have a really wide range of outcomes in your home league draft. Like if he's going like TE8 in the first 7-8 rounds, like absolutely not. But if he's starting to go more like the Dalton Schultz, Tyler Higbee range, again, I'd like rather just swing at that upside, even though those guys are a little bit safer. To a lesser extent, Kyle Pitts, if he falls, because people are just kind of sick of him. I know the floor is not there, but I like swinging on the upside. But again, like with the Goddard point, if he's going in like round 6, like I'm not having that. But I've seen him slip sometimes into, like pick 80 or so. And then at that point, I think it becomes a little more worth it. Mark, what about tight end targets and macro strategy for you?
Yeah, I think similar to Jack said, I really only want to leave with one tight end. Did another home league draft last week, and like Gerald Everett and Luke Musgrave were both, not even drafted at all. And those are guys that we're pretty excited to get in best ball. So, as Jack said, I think there's always solid replacements on the waiver wire if you don't get, an elite one. And then, but typically, especially again, if it's like a 2 wide receiver and 1 flex league, I think, elite tight ends are that much more important because the positional scarcity is, you're not competing with 3 wide receivers on opposing teams. You're only competing with 2, and there's going to be a lot of wide receivers later in the draft that, have better upside than kind of the late round tight ends. So again, knowing your roster construction and league format is important there. In terms of targets, similar to you guys with Mark Andrews, love him, hoping I can get him like in the 3rd round of home league drafts. For sure. I'm not sure if I'm reaching up into the 2nd to get someone like him, but certainly in the 3rd round, I think that's an easy take this year. I'm interested to see how the steam of Darren Waller and like these sharper formats transitions to home leagues. I think Darren Waller and at the end of the 5th or 6th round is a great pick this year because, someone like him, we kind of know the targets are going to go his way unless he gets injured. And in a redraft league, like I'm much more excited to take that gamble because if he does get hurt, obviously that hurts your roster a little bit, but you can drop him and pick up another tight end. So he's someone I'm more excited about drafting in the middle rounds. And then later, I think if you don't get kind of those top like 5 to 6 tight ends, I would prefer to wait, really late in the draft and probably scoop up like a Everett, Tyler Higbee, Musgrave, who are fine to start, and they're not going to offer too much upside. But then Leone, like you mentioned, just be quick to act on the waiver wire early in the season because the waiver wire is one of our biggest assets in redraft and home league. So I want to utilize it as best as we can.
Yeah, a couple really good points there from Mark. I especially like the one you talked about. A lot of leagues I'm in are 2 wide receivers and 1 flex, and I hadn't really considered that impact on the tight end, more like the wide receiver versus running back dynamic. But that's a good point because like we really do expect to beat our league mates by being better at assessing running back and wide receiver values throughout the draft than them. So, and then also, it is a switch up from me, even with a couple of these under my belt, doing the best ball drafts, doing some of these higher stakes leagues where you have the really deep benches, and you got to adjust to having sometimes a 5-person bench. And then when you throw in kicker and defense, like these 16 round drafts are really like 13, 14 rounds in terms of like the total amount of skill players that you're going to roster, which absolutely changes things up a little bit. Let's go to the running back position. And this year is different to me than in past years. A lot of times I'm a little bit more pro 0 RB than this year, but the costs in general on the running backs, I think, are a little bit lower in your home league. That might not translate quite as much, but I do think it's permeating to an extent. And I also think in what, Jack's written about the RB dead zone a lot in the past, like rounds 3 through 6, where we're hammering wide receivers because running backs are typically bad bets. There's some guys that break that RB dead zone mold that have legitimately high ceilings. You've got Travis Etienne, you've got Breece Hall, you've got Kenneth Walker, J.K. Dobbins, Javonte Williams to an extent, maybe a little bit later, like round 6, 7. But there's guys that I'm fine taking there. And then at the beginning of the draft too, once you get past the wide receiver tier with like Diggs, Adams, A.J. Brown, CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra, maybe you'd include Waddle and Wilson, but like you get that 2-3 turn and like Jonathan Taylor's there versus Chris Olave, and we'll see where Jonathan Taylor lands. We're recording this as like it's the last half hour of the trade deadline. I'd rather take the running back swing at that point. So Jack, your thoughts on the RB dead zone this year and how that affects how you're treating home leagues?
Yeah, I personally still lean wide receiver at that 2-3 turn, especially if the choice is like Taylor or Ramondre Stevenson or whoever. But I think a big thing with running back, and it also applies to receiver, is just knowing how your league mates are going to draft, how much they're going to rely on the default rankings of whatever site you're drafting on, because some of these sites have like wide receivers really low. So you can get like insane wide receiver values late, at which point maybe you start to consider quote unquote reaching on a running back just because you know that those receivers are going to be available later. But in general, I do still prefer to go receiver heavy through the first like 5 or 6 rounds. But if I can get someone like Jahan Dotson, who on ESPN is ranked, I think like 85th or 90th or something, then I become okay taking a running back swing in 1 or 2 of those first 4 or 5 rounds, knowing that I can fall back on the receivers later on.
Yeah, Mark, it's like, looking at our full PPR ranking or our half PPR rankings, for example, we've got guys like Mike Williams, Christian Kirk, Christian Watson, just inside the top 50 overall players. And the ADP from Fantasy Pros, which is like, it's hard to get good home league ADP, right? Because like some of it's bad, but then like there are leagues like that. So it's like, it's difficult. But the ADP on these guys is more like rounds 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's like, if you really can get a couple of these guys and some rookie wide receivers, we'll talk about it, wide receiver late, then I'm hard pressed to not come out of the first couple of rounds with a running back. Even knowing I want to build wide receiver heavy. So how do you sort of view that, and what have you seen in your league so far?
I generally want to leave the first 2 rounds with at least one running back that I feel good about. Obviously things can change once the draft starts. And if there is an insane value at wide receiver, let's say, I don't know, you're drafting 10th and like Cooper Kupp falls all the way there. And I would be inclined to draft Cooper Kupp. And then in the second round, if I don't know, AJ Brown is there, maybe you can take him over like a Tony Pollard, but typically I would like to leave the first 2 rounds with a running back, just because I think typically in these home leagues too, like at least I know my league mates will try and fill out their starting roster before taking like a 3rd or 4th wide receiver. So even if there's a great wide receiver value there, like people will just choose quarterbacks over him because they want to fill out that starting roster. So I typically always find myself in home leagues just being shocked at some of the wide receiver values between kind of rounds like 6 and 9. And similar to what Jack said, I'm fine reaching a bit more on running backs, especially in the first 2 rounds, just to secure one. And then, hopefully kind of in that round 7, 8, 9 range, I can get some value at wide receiver and also add someone like a David Montgomery or James Cook or, these guys that were a little higher than market on and might be a little cheaper in home leagues. I think those are perfectly fine RB2 targets. And as you mentioned, Leone, earlier, a lot of these drafts, you're only drafting 14 players if you include, a kicker and a defense at the back end there. So there's guys at the end of drafts that, we'd love to get in best ball that are just available for free or won't get drafted. So typically lean into, the earlier running backs if possible, if, breaking a tie there.
Yeah, I'd say like at the 1-2 turn, Bijan Robinson and Tony Pollard are big targets for me. In some of your leagues, like there might be some lag on where Pollard should go, and you can even get him a little deeper into the second round, which would be amazing. Mentioned like once you start getting into the 3-4 turn, the 4th round, guys like Breece Hall, Travis Etienne, Kenneth Walker are interesting to me. According to our ranks, like Alexander Madison might be someone that people forget about. Like you start getting him more like 6th round. I do think, at some point, similar to quarterback, you might have to deviate from where the running backs are in our overall ranks and just be like somewhat tethered to the market that your league is in, and just take the value lost when it's shortest. But I do really like your point, Mark, about people filling out their starting lineups, and just want to go a little bit on a tangent on that with we're building to optimize the team over the course of the whole season, have sort of a monster team come the end of the year. we're not building to optimize what our projected points are for our team week 1. And people just underrate the chaos that's going to occur. Like the bust rate on picks after rounds like 6 or 7 is so high, and even early it's way higher than people realize. So you just consider that when you're building out depth for your bench, especially like at wide receiver, which we're going to talk about in a second. Getting as many upside bets or just strong bets in general, the word upside sometimes is overused. You're just trying to maximize your ability to navigate when there's going to be bye weeks. There's going to be busts you don't see. There's going to be players that break out that you didn't expect that become clear starters. And again, know your league settings. If you're in a league that 4 out of 12 teams make the playoffs, you might put a little bit more pressure on yourself to have a solid starting lineup out of the gate. I'm in a league where 8 out of 12 teams make the playoffs. Like I am optimizing for the end of the season. If my team makes the playoffs, the team wasn't winning anyways. Like I just got to be top 8 and then hope to have a monster come the playoffs. But I do want to give both you guys a chance if there's any specific RB targets that I didn't mention that you guys really like this year.
Yeah, I mean, my top 2 are James Cook and David Montgomery, and I think that's pretty much who a lot of us at ETR like. I think both fit the mold of the like week 1 role with massive upside if something happens to their backfield mates. So those are the 2 I'm really in on.
Yeah, I like Alexander Madison, as you mentioned earlier, in those middle rounds. I think we're relatively conservative, honestly, on his base projection. And Dwayne McBride got cut today by the Vikings. There's really unproven talent behind him. So I'm kind of with Silva on loving Madison this year at the end of the 5th and 6th round. I think he's a great RB2. And then later in rounds, I think like if you do take one running back early and kind of wait towards the end, I'm a fan of the Washington backfield. I like taking either Brian Robinson or Antonio Gibson. Those are 2 of my favorite targets in like the 10th round area. Typically prioritize Robinson more in half PPR scoring and Gibson more in PPR, but both are, I think, solid targets. And Washington offense is, just one that I'm betting on in general to have a good season, and they're all relatively affordable in drafts.
And to what Jack said, like both those guys are a poorer version of you've got some standalone value with upside if the league mates go down.
I do want to mention, sorry, I'll mention one more here. Jaylen Warren, I think, is one that probably is going to go a lot later in home leagues. Most people still love Najee Harris and the quote unquote projectable volume that he has and locked in role there. So I think Jaylen Warren is probably someone you can get a lot cheaper in home leagues.
Yeah, Najee Harris was kept for $75 in a home league that I recently did in a $250 budget league. But yeah, I did want to hit on like if you do draft real wide receiver heavy, or even if you don't, like running back stashes are great because it's a volume dependent position. Guys may earn volume on talent that we didn't see, or there's just gonna be injuries. So some guys that are going higher and sharper leagues that might not in your home league, like Jaylen Warren's a perfect example, but even Zach Charbonnet, Tank Bigsby, there's some of these guys that make sense to stash on your bench late. Definitely wanted to make that note. Let's go to wide receiver, which is the best position out there. But we do have a bias towards wide receiver, especially if you're like full PPR leagues or leagues where you start 3 wide receivers, where I think people just underestimate the floor ceiling combination of the position and also how that scarcity could run out if you do have to start 3 and you're starting running back heavy. But unlike running back, talent really, really drives the volume at the wide receiver position. And that's why these guys are a little bit safer picks overall, and the injury rates are a little bit lower at the position. So we like to start wide receiver heavy, as Jack noted. Mark and I kind of hit on getting at least one running back early, though, just because the way that I think this specific year shakes out. But my general targets at the wide receiver position is to try and get, the 1-2 turn. There's so many guys you can take. Like, I think it just pick any of them. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Devontae Adams, Garrett Wilson, whoever's your favorite, CeeDee Lamb. Like, I'm not going to quibble too much with who you take. I think getting like one of those guys there makes sense. But when you start to get to the middle rounds, like some of the values we see are either on like really high upside offenses, like Christian Kirk and Mike Williams for the Jaguars and the Los Angeles Chargers, or They're breakout players where I think maybe the ceiling might be a little bit undervalued, like Christian Watson, who goes, I think, maybe too high in sharp leagues, but then maybe too low in some casual leagues. And really like stashing a couple of the rookie wide receivers this year, even understanding you might not get that production right away, but we've got 4 receivers with round 1 draft capital that all look pretty good in good spots between Jackson Smith and Jigba, Zay Flowers, Quentin Johnson, and Jordan Addison. So I'm really targeting those guys heavily once I hit round 7. Mark, any specific wide receiver notes for you, macro strategy or micro player takes?
I like a lot of the ones you mentioned, so I won't repeat really any there. But I do think one kind of like minor edge I've noticed in home leagues is that player or my league mates are like hesitant to take technically the quote unquote wide receiver 2 in a certain offense, like the Dolphins, Jalen Waddle, with the Bengals, T Higgins, stuff like that. And those are receivers we project really well just because those teams are going to throw a lot and be really concentrated with their target share. So I think those are kind of situations to attack, like wide receiver 2 or 3s on, offenses that we expect to pass a lot. So you mentioned it, like Jordan Addison, I think since he's a rookie and everyone loves Justin Jefferson and, knows TJ Hawkinson, like had a bunch of targets down the stretch there last year. I think like he's going to be a guaranteed value in a lot of home league drafts. So I like him. And then, similar with Jahan Dotson, Jack mentioned him earlier, like wide receiver 2 in his offense, but we're expecting kind of a leap there from Washington. So I think, those guys are likely to slip a little in drafts just because they aren't the bona fide wide receiver 1 for their own team, even though that's not necessarily a huge factor in fantasy.
Yeah, that, and also a couple of things we've talked about. One, the default rankings, are outdated sometimes. And two, like the position, when we get steam in some of these sharp leagues at wide receiver, especially that like middle tier, doesn't seem to apply to home leagues as quickly. Like there's a lag, and I'm glad you hit on Dotson. I'd say Gabe Davis is maybe in that mold too, where he's starting to go really early now in some of these sharp leagues, but he's buried a little bit more in the default rankings. He's also got the wide receiver 2 thing, and you've also are starting to hit that range where Mark said earlier, people are trying to fill out their starting lineups rather than get that wide receiver depth. So you can really beat people by being willing to be the first one to draft wide receivers to your bench, which sounds silly, but that's where over the course of a season, it could really pay dividends. Thoughts at the wide receiver position, Jack?
Yeah, I think you guys mostly nailed it. One thing I'll add that I think some people in home leagues might shy away from, maybe it's permeating like public knowledge a little bit more, but the idea that correlating your wide receivers with a quarterback is a good thing. I think a lot of people try to avoid that because they think it's risky, but that correlation is actually good when we're trying to finish first in leagues as opposed to, avoiding downfall. So accepting a little bit of that correlative risk in exchange for the downside. It's not something you should go out of your way for. But if you have a certain quarterback looking for receivers on his team and giving them maybe the edge in a tiebreaker if you're caught between 2 guys, and vice versa, if you draft a receiver early, don't go into week 1 with like Mac Jones as your starting quarterback because you drafted Juju. But if you drafted Justin Jefferson and you're caught in between Geno and Kirk Cousins, maybe that tilts the scale toward Kirk.
Yeah, I've done some research. It's a few years old now, but one of the first articles I did for ETR when I came over here was stacking for home leagues. And it's pretty simple. If the quarterback beats their ADP expectation, the odds of the pass catchers beating their ADP expectation increases pretty significantly and vice versa. So it's not just the double points in a given week. That's nice, but it's more like the season-long correlation. So if you're betting on Lamar Jackson to have a breakout year, he's going to throw a lot more in Todd Monken's offense. Taking Mark Andrews, taking Zay Flowers, taking Rashad Bateman, guys that we kind of like individually anyways, bumping those guys up makes absolutely a ton of sense. Any final words before we close out the Dominate Your Home League Draft podcast?
I think the big one I'll leave, and we've mentioned it a few times, is know the draft applet rankings that you're gonna be going into for your respective drafts. Adam does a great series on ETR, highlighting like the biggest discrepancies in our ETR rankings versus the individual draft applets default rankings. So I think that's such a massive one. And then again, I'll harp on knowing your league settings. So I think you can go into those, go into your drafts with those two things at the top of your mind, I think things are going to fall the right way for you.
Yeah, there's some minor things at the end of drafts too. Like if you're in a keeper league and you've got IR spots, someone like Jameson Williams, who actually I guess he's suspended, right? So not can't go on the IR. Never mind, scratch that one. But you can sometimes find IR guys, and also sometimes you don't have to draft kicker and defense, and it's worth taking some of these running back stashes we mentioned and just seeing what happens between now and the start of the season. Obviously, there's not a ton of time, but it's pretty much risk-free for positions that you can stream. Any parting words for us, Jack?
Yeah, Mark mentioned what I was going to say with just knowing your draft applet and default rankings. I guess another point would just be in the double-digit rounds, all you should really care about is upside, because with the benefit of the waiver wire, if someone doesn't pan out, you can just drop them and move on. And then Leone kind of just touched on it, but targeting guys where we're more likely to know in week one if they're going to be relevant or not, as opposed to having to wait a few weeks and see how things turn out. Just, that information edge of knowing sooner and knowing if you can drop a guy or keep a guy is pretty valuable.
Yeah, and on the upside point too, that's where I will deviate, particularly at pass catcher from our rankings, because once you get past round 7 or so, the bust rate on guys is so high anyways. And if you do get it, kind of a veteran that hits in that range, it's usually a small hit and something that's not irreplaceable just off the waiver wire. So taking stabs on younger players, rookie players, where the hit rate might be lower, but if they do hit, could just have an outsized impact on whether or not you win your league. It is something to really look out for and take into account. It's hard to get that directly into the rankings, depending exactly what your format is. But thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in. Hope you have great home league drafts this year. If you want to get the Establish to Run rankings, go over to Establish to Run, subscribe to the draft kit. Jack and Mark and I have been working a ton on this over the off season, and we're going to apply that same work to DFS. So getting ready for that as well, if you guys are DFS players. But yeah, if you can rate, review the podcast on iTunes, subscribe to the Establish the Edge YouTube channel, give a thumbs up there. That's a huge help for continuing to produce this content for free. Thanks, everybody.